This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Funding for the Think podcast comes from Wise, an app for people using money around the globe. With the Wise account, you can send, spend, and receive in up to 40 currencies. You can download the Wise app or learn more at wise.com. Terms and conditions apply.
From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm John McKay, in for Chris Boyd. The relationship between Mexico and the United States has seen better days, much better days. President Donald Trump has argued for all intents and purposes drug cartels are in charge in Mexico. He has threatened to order the U.S. military to strike them inside Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's president, and others vehemently disagree, pointing to the recent death of the country's most wanted drug dealer while attempting to escape capture. Real threat or not, Arturo Sarucan believes Donald Trump's warning needs to be taken seriously. He is an international consultant and career diplomat who from 2007 to 2013 served as Mexico's ambassador to the United States. He just wrote, "Can Mexico avoid a confrontation with the United States?" for Foreign Affairs magazine. He joins me this hour. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Think.
It's a pleasure, John.
Say, we really are at a tipping point, you believe, right?
Look, there's no doubt that we are probably living the worst moment in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship since the 1980s, when again an issue related to organized crime completely collapsed the bilateral relationship. And I'm referring to the murder of a DEA agent on Mexican soil, Enrique Camarena, in 1985. And curiously, it happened at the same time of geopolitical volatility in the Americas, because Mexico and the U.S. at that time, and you may recall this is the Reagan administration, we're in the midst of what we used to call Cold War 2.0, when the United States decides that the potential encroachment of the Soviet Union in the hemisphere, particularly in Central America, in support of the Sandinista movement that sought to topple dictator Somoza, the Farabundo Martí movement in El Salvador that was also trying to topple an authoritarian regime, pitted Mexico and the United States. Mexico led an effort by several Latin American countries, Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Mexico, the so-called Contadora group, to sort of try and ensure a peaceful resolution to the conflicts in Central America, while the United States was convinced that this was the beginning of a potential quote-unquote domino effect, that if the Soviets were able to put proxy regimes in Central America, that could lead to greater encroachment by the Soviets in the continent. And the current crises with Mexico, again, sort of you see this conflation of a purely bilateral crises in the relationship, along with a very volatile global context, and in particular, as a result of President Trump's national security strategy published in December of last year, a much more assertive, a much more aggressive U.S. foreign policy towards the American continent. We've seen that with Venezuela. We're seeing that with Cuba. I'd like to remind your audience that this Mexican government and the previous Mexican government of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's the current president's political mentor, have been playing footsie with Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, providing them with diplomatic support. And in fact, until President Trump put a gun to Mexico's forehead in January of this year, Mexico was the principal provider of subsidized or free oil to Cuba. So in many ways, we see a repeat of what we saw in the 1980s, but with, I think, a qualitatively different dynamic, because President Trump is, for all intents and purposes, weaponizing interdependence between Mexico and the United States. What do I mean by this? that he is leveraging every single issue of the bilateral relationship to secure concessions from Mexico. That is, he's threatened punitive tariffs against Mexico linked to migration flows coming through Mexico to the US-Mexico border, obviously to the issue of organized crime, particularly fentanyl and fentanyl trafficking from Mexico through the United States. And along with this, a rhetoric where Mexico has become sort of a political electoral piñata, even from his first presidential campaign back in 2015. Along with that, you've had the previous Mexican government, which eviscerated, destroyed U.S.-Mexico security collaboration. And by security collaboration, John, I not only mean our efforts to confront transnational criminal organizations operating on both sides of our common border. It's a much larger piece of issues related to security in North America. How do we ensure that the perimeter of North America is secure not only against criminal organizations, but against potential terrorist groups, against cyber threats, against the encroachment of Russia in Mexico using bot farms in Spanish to polarize and divide American public opinion, particularly in Hispanic communities up and down the United States, Chinese growing economic footprint in the region. So the problem is that the result of López Obrador's 6 years in office destroyed that security collaboration that I was a part of in building during my tenure as ambassador with the Bush administration, Bush 43 administration, and then the Obama administration. And so you've got, in many ways, a perfect storm. You've got a president that is determined to sort of weaponize this interdependence, the most complex, probably bilateral relationship that the United States has with any country on the face of the earth. Need to remind your audience, obviously something that most in Texas understand, at least instinctively, which is that there's no more important country for the daily well-being, prosperity, security of Americans than the relationship with Mexico. And now Mexico has become the US's #1 trading partner. We are the largest exporter of goods to the United States, and we're also now the largest buyer of US exports on the face of the earth.
You mentioned López Obrador, who we'll refer to as AMLO. People call him AMLO. The president has claimed that, look, what really happened was that he approached criminal organizations with this mantra of hugs, not bullets. And that, in effect, and you've said this, in effect, tended to destroy whatever assistance there was between the two countries with regard to drugs and drug cartels. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. In fact, President López Obrador's mantras, to which you've referred to, of hugs, not bullets, which was a basic way of saying, I will not take on organized crime, became what I call hugs for thugs. And it not only destroyed U.S.-Mexico collaboration on law enforcement and counter-narcotics cooperation, but more importantly, it allowed a Pax Narca to resurface in Mexico. That is the ability of organized crime to conduct its business thanks to politicians that were either in their pockets or that turned their eyes in another direction. And what you started to see, John, was an encroachment by criminal organizations in Mexico, big and small, into the daily lives of citizens, of businesses, of local and state politics. And I think the exhibit A of this very, very worrisome trend came in Mexico's midterms in 2023, when there were several governorships up for grabs in that midterm election in Mexico. And you saw organized crime whipping or suppressing the vote in favor of Morena. Morena is the party that has been in power since López Obrador won in 2018, whipping or suppressing votes to support Morena candidates, and you saw governors today in power that, to say it very bluntly, raise very important question marks as to their relationship to these criminal organizations. And so that, I think, is one of the dynamics that completely changed the calculus and the narrative and the concerns on the US side of the border. And to this, we can add López Obrador's constant statements that fentanyl was not an issue in Mexico, that fentanyl was not being produced in Mexico, when, by the way, his armed forces, days before he says this, had been crowing about the seizure of a lab producing fentanyl pills in Mexico. And then, on top of this, he started criticizing, with ad hominem attacks, members of the US Senate, one of them who is now Secretary of State, by lashing out and criticizing them for questioning his law enforcement and anti-organized crime politics. So this really became a toxic brew. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the legacies that Claudia Sheinbaum is now having to deal with because of that eviscerated state of collaboration with the United States. And it's in this context that Donald Trump returns to the White House, and where we see this extremely heightened pressure on Mexico. We see the threats of unilateral use of force by the United States on Mexican soil. We see this Trumpian narrative of saying, well, I like her very much, she's a great lady, but she's unwilling to take organized crime, or she's afraid to take on organized crime, or probably the most damning statement that Trump has made, which you had never, ever heard from a U.S. president in the modern history of U.S.-Mexico relations, saying that there's an untenable alliance between the Mexican government and organized crime in Mexico.
My guest is former Mexican ambassador to the United States, Arturo Sarucán. We're talking about U.S. threats to strike Mexico's drug cartels. You're listening to Think. I'm John McKay, in for Chris Boyd. Well, that's what I was curious about. ProPublica, the journalism organization in the United States, has said that the Drug Enforcement Administration, which had and still has no love for López Obrador, they claim that the cartels and Obrador are together, and that they had been substantially contributing to his campaigns for years, not just his, but his inner circle. Now, he's denied that.
Well, he certainly has, and there is information that investigations into those potential ties at different points were dropped by different U.S. administrations because of fear of sort of being seen as meddling in domestic Mexican political affairs. I have, obviously, John, no data. I'm not in the law enforcement. I'm not in law enforcement. I never was in law enforcement, but obviously, as Mexican ambassador to the United States, you have a whole of government approach to the relationship. But it's unclear whether there's a direct connection between López Obrador and organized crime. But what is very clear is that people in his very close circle, people who were very close to him, the man who succeeded him as governor of the state that he was governor in, who later became his minister of the interior, who then became the majority leader of the Senate, they do have direct ties with people who are involved with organized crime. And the fact that López Obrador allowed himself to be photographed going to the hometown of drug kingpin El Chapo and got off his car to say hello personally and shake the hand of the mother obviously raises a lot of questions. Never in my life, as a professional diplomat, as an ambassador, now as a consultant and civilian living in Washington, D.C., had I ever seen the perceptions that exist today generally across the board that Mexico is one of the most significant national security vulnerabilities for the United States, and that the U.S.-Mexico border is a source of those vulnerabilities. And that, in many ways, is López Obrador's legacy.
A lot of the complaints about the strength of the cartels in Mexico is blamed on the policies again of AMLO, as we've been talking about before. The current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, she is his chosen successor. So, what exactly is she like? And she had pledged to continue a lot of his policies, but this issue of the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, that's got to be something she's struggling with.
Absolutely. I've said that 2026 is probably going to be one of the most decisive years in recent history in the relationship between Mexico and the United States, in part because, as many of your listeners know, particularly because of Texas always having been an economic spark plug in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, we are in the midst of the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, statutory review, which by July 1st should that review should lead to either a decision to continue the free trade agreement, to abrogate it, or to enter into a process of annual reviews. And that in many ways is conditioning a lot of what you're seeing in how both Mexico City and Washington, DC are approaching one another in the bilateral relationship, because obviously President Sheinbaum, whom you've mentioned, is absolutely clear-headed that she needs to Teflon coat and protect and ensure the survival of USMCA. And President Trump is using all these issues, including law enforcement collaboration and counter-narcotics efforts, to condition that USMCA review, which is ongoing. So that has, I think Claudia Sheinbaum is as nationalistic as López Obrador. They both, I think, don't care about foreign policy and international affairs. Probably the only difference is that whereas López Obrador would give the finger to foreign policy into the world, I think Claudia Sheinbaum has not done that. I think she's more level-headed, she's more pragmatic. But the reality is that this issue in particular of how Mexico and the United States confront transnational criminal organizations on both sides of the border has become a sort of a key issue because of the way that the Trump administration is leveraging that against every other issue, whether it's water of the Rio Grande, whether it's avocado exports to the U.S., whether it's trade, to the issue of collaboration on organized crime. She is a creature of López Obrador, but I think that from day one, and you sort of saw that via the choice that she made of who her public security secretary is, the government has, I think, done a tactical tack in the fight against organized crime. I don't think it's a strategic shift, but they have been going after organized crime in a more coherent way, in part because, again, they have a gun pointed at their head by the U.S. because of the threat of unilateral use of force by the U.S. on Mexican soil. And that's why you've seen renditions of criminals wanted by the U.S. Without a formal extradition process as a means to send them to the United States. That's why you've seen a much more aggressive stance in the fight against the Sinaloa cartel. And that's why you saw this operation that was in many ways a joint operation, because there was a lot of U.S. intelligence provided to the Mexican authorities. Yeah. There are some of us who suspect that there was also kinetic U.S. support on the ground during the day of the operation that led to the death of the Jalisco Nueva Generación kingpin Nemesio Ceguera, who was killed as a result of the operation. Now, the question is this going to be enough to prevent the U.S. from going down the road of using a unilateral military strike? And by this, I mean that probably you're not going to see U.S. Marines parachute into Mexico, but what you might see, John, is a drone, a U.S. armed drone blowing up a fentanyl laboratory somewhere in the state of Sonora or Sinaloa or along the border. Is this going to be enough? We'll see. I think the operation that led to the death of El Mencho has bought Mexico some time. Is as a result of that operation, is the prospect of a U.S. unilateral use of force on Mexican soil a probability? I don't think so, at least not in the medium term. Is it plausible? Absolutely. And I think that's what I sort of suggest in my piece in Foreign Affairs, that the Mexican government needs to take this threat and this possibility very seriously, and it should be doing a series of things to ensure that it doesn't materialize, because, John, the moment the U.S. does this, it's going to put the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship in a downward nosedive, and regardless of whether it's a left-wing, a centrist, or a right-wing president in Mexico, it puts them against the wall in the relationship with the United States.
You know, this effort that, well, I shouldn't say effort, but the operation that resulted in the death of El Mencho, who we should explain to people, he was not just another cartel leader. This was the most sought-after man in Mexico. And you've mentioned this, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. This is considered by some to be the most violent transnational criminal organization in this hemisphere.
Absolutely. It's I think, the most violent transnational criminal organization operating in the Americas. It has created enormous levels of violence in Mexico. El Mencho was not a has-been. He was the actual. There's a lot of speculation, I must say, whether he was sick and whether that had meant that he wasn't in the forefront of the daily efforts of the control and operation of the cartel. But certainly this was the most powerful and most relevant leader of the most powerful and most relevant criminal organization, and a transnational criminal organization that, by the way, operates on the U.S. side of the border, operates in the rest of Latin America, and which has started to develop ties and operating capabilities in places like Europe.
You know, when he was killed, there was so much violence that we saw across parts of Mexico.
Yeah.
Was that, you think, evidence of the strength of this organization? That even though he was killed, and the government knew it, and they knew about the cooperation, cars were blown up. There were fires everywhere. There was threats at airports, things like that. Was this evidence of what Donald Trump was saying about the cartels being in control in Mexico?
Well, I think it clearly speaks to the huge operational capability of this very violent and very powerful organization. It speaks, I think, of what I think has always been Mexico's Achilles heel, not only with López Obrador or Claudia Sheinbaum. It's been Mexico's Achilles heel for a very, very long time, which is a weak rule of law, and the inability of the government of the state to confront these criminal organizations. And so I think that the response that we saw was a very, very powerful symbol of what's at stake, but also of something that I think is one of the most worrisome facets of what I have seen as a result of President Trump's return to power, which is that we're going back, John, to an era of mutual recrimination and finger pointing. This is such a complex relationship that if one finger points in one direction across the border, there's always going to be 2 or 3 fingers pointing back in the other direction. And that's why when I was ambassador with first President Bush and then President Obama, we established a core principle of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, which was shared responsibility. Given that a lot of the challenges that Mexico and the United States face in our bilateral agenda are transnational in nature, we need transnational solutions. Yes, Mexico has to improve its justice system, its rule of law, defang organized crime operating in Mexico, prevent drug trafficking from moving northbound. But the U.S. has an obligation too to prevent bulk cash shipments across the U.S.-Mexico border southbound, and most importantly, John, the flow of weapons illicitly bought in gun shops and gun shows in the United States, and that cross the border and feed the firepower of Mexican organized crime. It won't surprise you that there are more there are more gun shops and gun shows than Walmarts along the border with Mexico. And that's giving you a bit of a sense of how these very violent criminal organizations are getting a significant majority of their high caliber and high powered weapons. You're seeing .50 Barrett rifles crossing the border into Mexico. And so what we established was this idea that for us to be successful and to move the needle, you needed to develop a paradigm of joint responsibility. What I think is the danger that I see is that with this finger pointing that is coming from the White House, that leads to then, it's the typical, the US saying, Mexico, you're the springboard of all the drugs coming into the United States, and Mexico conveniently and logically retorting that if we're the springboard, the US is the swimming pool, because of the issues of demand and because of what has always been a driver of narcotics consumption and illicit drug consumption in the United States. And that dynamic is bad. When nationalist jingoism pervades the discourse, the bilateral discourse coming from both Washington and Mexico, that tends to be a very, very bad bedfellow to the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, there really has been this pushback. Many in Mexico complaining that American strikes inside Mexico, that would be a very clear infringement of Mexico's sovereignty. But you argue that it's too late to make complaints about imperialism. That's not a strategy to solve this problem for either country.
Absolutely, and not only is that true, there are significant portions of Mexican public opinion that would applaud unilateral U.S. action on Mexican soil because they're so fed up of the levels of violence, of coercion, of kidnapping, of extortion that organized crime is like any other business. It does hostile takeovers and mergers and acquisitions. And if you're being squeezed in your ability to say, introduce fentanyl across the border into the United States, you go into other illicit businesses, whether it's illegal fuel shipments or human trafficking and human smuggling, extortion and kidnapping, and so on and so forth. And this has a very pernicious effect on the well-being of Mexicans. So there's a non-negligible chunk of Mexicans who would applaud and who would sort of welcome something like what Trump is threatening to do. The challenge is that obviously, again, if that were to happen, it puts this relationship. First of all, it will give Claudia Sheinbaum's Taliban, what I call the Taliban wing of her party, the more extreme left of her party, the perfect excuse, John. They've been itching to sort of scupper the U.S.-Mexico relationship because they support Cuba, they support Venezuela. They're not very happy that Sheinbaum has been forced by Trump to sort of stop deliveries of oil to Cuba. So they'd love a pissing match with the United States. So that's, this rhetoric of imperialism and, tit for tat, who's responsible, serves no one. Number two, López Obrador used to say that Mexico and the United States can't collaborate on security because there's no trust. In my experience as a Mexican diplomat for 25 years and as a Mexican ambassador to the United States, is that in the U.S.-Mexico relationship, it's actually the other way around. It's by collaborating and cooperating that you build bilateral trust and mutual trust in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. And that's what we did during my tenure of almost 7 years as Mexican ambassador to the United States. And then finally, I think that Sheinbaum should turn this on its head. You have seen that she has been sort of banging her drum about, Mexico is sovereign and Mexican sovereignty, and we will never accept an imposition by the United States. If I were her, I would probably turn this around on its head and say, look, and I'd say this to the Mexican people, publicly and loudly and unequivocally, if there's one thing that threatens the sovereignty of the Mexican people and of Mexico, it's the ability of transnational criminal organizations to conduct their business on Mexican soil. And therefore, that would lead to a full relaunch of the security collaboration with the United States. And again, by security collaboration, yes, fighting transnational criminal organizations, but more importantly, given the volatility and the fluidity that we're seeing in the global arena, the relaunching of a North American security paradigm that ensures that Canada, Mexico, and the United States together can work to ensure that our perimeters are secure. And you've got a sort of a test right around the corner, which is the 2026 Canada, Mexico, United States World Cup, where we could be doing a lot of stuff to enhance everything from border security to trusted traveler programs, which unfortunately, given the state of relationships between Washington and Canada and Washington and Mexico, we're probably not doing, John.
Yeah, I can't imagine that any of this has no effect at all on other Latin American countries. They have to be seeing this and seeing what's going on and be concerned.
Yeah, and it's not only relevant to Latin American countries. I can't start telling you the number of European or Asian ambassadors in Washington today that come to me and say, please explain what's going on, because in many ways, the template of how the U.S.-Mexico relationship operates, one of the most important bilateral relationships on the earth for the United States today, it sort of has a lot of significance and relevance to how these other countries manage their bilateral relationships with the United States.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, let's say worst comes to worst, and there is some kind of unilateral military action. How should Mexico respond, do you think?
Well, first of all, if there is, sort of my hopes would be that if there's any U.S. operational footprint on Mexican soil, it's the result of a historic decision by the Mexican government to engage in a very different way with the United States by allowing joint operations, obviously led by Mexico, coordinated by Mexico, but with the support of the United States. I think that would go a long way in neutralizing this threat of the unilateral use of force. But obviously, if there is a unilateral use of force, that in terms of international law, John, is a violation of the UN Charter and of the international law itself. So it's very likely that if something like this would happen, Mexico that has always tended to have a very legalistic, multilateral driven approach to its foreign policy, will take this issue to the UN Security Council, to the UN General Assembly, and potentially to the International Court of Justice. So that will obviously raise the volume and the temperature. Whereas there is obviously a huge asymmetry of hard power between Mexico and the United States. Mexico isn't toothless. It has a number of tools that it can use to put pressure on the United States. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of your show, the fact that we are the number one largest buyer of U.S. exports does give Mexico significant leverage, because there are so many states in the United States that depend on their trade with Mexico to export everything from agricultural products to finished goods to services, where Mexico could sort of shut down a lot of that and retaliate by, slapping tariffs on U.S. ag goods, for example. It would obviously shut down all collaboration with the U.S. on security issues at a moment where I think the U.S. can't afford that. And it would very likely expel all law enforcement and security and intelligence U.S. personnel seconded to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and to the United States consulates across Mexican territory. So the only thing that would happen, obviously, is that this could spiral out of control. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt that Mexico would have the short end of the stick, both diplomatically and in terms of hard power. But I think at the end of the day, the big loss would be the type of synergistic relationship that we had been building between the United States for the past 3-4 decades, which again should be a strategic boon to the United States, because in many ways the United States is able to do what it needs to do around the world because everything else being equal, it has a relatively secure border with a stable country on its southern border. If this were to happen, that dynamic completely changes.
You know, you're right. In terms of agricultural products that are coming from Mexico, I'm thinking of or going to Mexico, pork that comes from Iowa, apples from Washington, cheese from Wisconsin, and all of these would be affected in ways that people don't seem to be talking about.
Absolutely. This what I think is, despite the rhetoric out there, has been an extremely successful two-way trade. Mexico and the United States, on any given day today, are trading $1.5 billion a day of goods in both directions. And to give your listeners a sense of what it means that Mexico is the largest buyer of U.S. exports, let me put it to you in sort of comparative regional terms. Mexico buys more U.S. exports today than all of Latin America and the Caribbean combined, John. Let me give you another regional example. Mexico buys more U.S. exports than all of the European Union countries put together. Mexico buys more U.S. exports than China and Japan combined, and Mexico buys more U.S. exports than the BRICS countries combined. So this is real. This is the economic dynamics that have been uncorked since NAFTA was negotiated, then after NAFTA was renegotiated by Trump during his first administration into the USMCA, have really created these integrated supply chains up and down North America. And these have a direct impact on everything from the cost of goods to the quality and the diversity of agricultural produce, because there's also another beauty in this relationship when it comes to agricultural exports, John, which is that we're seasonal. When you produce, we don't, and when we produce, you don't. And so, with the exception of a few ag commodities, we're not competing with one another. And so there would be a real immediate impact. And then on top of this, Mexico is home today to the largest U.S. expat community anywhere on the face of the earth. The calculus is that there are probably 1.5, 1.6 million Americans living permanently in Mexico today. And obviously, I don't have to tell you about Mexicans. We have approximately 11 million Mexicans, 5 million of whom are undocumented, but you've got 35 million Mexican Americans in the United States. So you've got a dynamic which I think is unique on the global stage, and which has completely changed the way these two countries impact one another's well-being, prosperity, and security, obviously.
You know, I live along the border. Might water delivery from the Rio Grande become even more of an issue than it is even now?
Well, if we look at how climate patterns are impacting the American Southwest, if we see what's happening with water tables along the Colorado River, along the Rio Grande, yes, it's going to become a serious problem. And I've always said that diplomatically, we're focused on immigration, we're focused on drugs, we're now focused on trade because of the USMCA review. But if there's one issue that is flashing red on my radar screen in the medium long term, it's going to be the water issue, because we're seeing a significant drought in along the sort of U.S. Southwest and northern Mexico, and that's going to impact the ability of both countries to comply with their obligations and how we share the waters of both the Colorado River and the Rio Grande.
You know, one of the reform proposals that you talk about is a permanent North American Security Secretariat. Maybe you could explain it, about a position that would be rotating between Mexico, the United States, and Canada.
Yeah, well, obviously, as a result of 9/11, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, reorganized its military commands and created what we all know today as NORTHCOM, the Northern Command, which is based in Colorado Springs at Peterson Air Force Base. Mexico and Canada have permanent liaison officers at NORTHCOM. The idea of NORTHCOM to ensure the security of North America. What I think we need to start doing is I think the problem with North American engagement on these issues is that we tend to aim high. We don't aim high and we don't hit, but we aim low and we do hit. And what I think we need is a much more ambitious template. And one of the ideas that I sort of try and propose in this piece that I wrote for Foreign Affairs is let's deepen our security collaboration. How do we do this? Let's create a joint border security agency that helps with customs, that ensures that our border is secure so that we can de-risk how we control our borders. Let's create a more permanent mechanism for security collaboration, which again, not only deals with transnational criminal organizations, but with terrorist threats. And given what's going on in the Persian Gulf, in the Middle East, and in Gaza, this should be at the top of our agendas, because look, you don't have to be Kissinger or rocket scientists to figure out that some of these terrorist groups do look at the Canadian and Mexican borders as potential avenues of impacting national security and threatening the homeland security of the United States. So we need to beef up our efforts, ensure that our common borders are not used by potential terrorists seeking to harm the U.S. homeland. Again, that's why I sort of thought that the World Cup, which was my baby, I was ambassador in Washington when I started advocating for a joint World Cup, and which President Obama sort of latched onto, and then it became the North American proposal, including Canada. But the idea, for example, Mexico has a global entry, which is a trusted traveler program with the United States. Mm-hmm. Canada and the United States have their trusted traveler program, which is Nexus. The tragedy is that those two systems, the one that the U.S. has with Canada and the one that the U.S. has with Mexico, don't talk to one another. We should create a single trusted traveler program for North America, which allows Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans to travel, those who belong to those who've done their biometrics and their fingerprints and all the stuff that are part of this trusted traveler program, to basically travel freely and seamlessly across our three North American borders. How do we take on the very significant cybersecurity challenges that we're facing vis-a-vis China, for example, or Iran? And I'm not only mentioning this in terms of our ability to ensure that they don't shut down an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, or that they don't shut down a transmission grid across the Canadian-U.S. border, the Mexican-U.S. border. I'm also talking about how we protect intellectual property of companies operating in North America from Chinese stealing intellectual property. So it's the idea is to really create a permanent mechanism that allows the three countries to deepen and widen our security collaboration, our ability to exchange intelligence and information, to enhance our ability to patrol our common borders in a joint and synergistic manner. So that was what I was trying to sort of suggest in the article.
You also talk about investing in what you call judicial capacity to fight high value targets.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, as I said, one of Mexico's long-term Achilles heels, one of its structural weaknesses, is the rule of law and a judiciary which is nowhere near what we need to confront organized crime, to combat corruption, to root out impunity. And so we really need to modernize the judiciary branch in Mexico. And that's why I'm, as many other Mexicans and many Americans who've been following this, extremely alarmed by the judicial reform that was pushed by Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the previous Mexican president, reforming the judiciary and allowing judges from local all the way up to the Supreme Court to be elected by popular vote. And when you've got organized crime increasingly encroaching upon the body politic of the country, this is extremely dangerous because you can have organized crime cherry picking or intimidating judges on the bench.
This is not something that Mexico or the United States or even Canada needs to think about down the road. You have said that these are changes. This is something that we need to deal with right now.
Absolutely. I think there's no time to waste. I think there are a number of structural issues that both countries need to, Mexico and the United States, but if we include Canada, simply because of the North American architecture that we should be building in a very volatile world. And if we build correctly on everything from critical minerals to energy efficiency and energy resilience, energy independence, energy security, to deepen and protect our integrated supply chains and our joint production platforms, the 21st century could really become the North American century. But the problem is that we're immersed in petty squabbles. Sort of our problem in North America has been that not that we aim too high and miss, it's that we aim too low and hit. That instead of being accomplices to failure, we become partners to success.
Arturo Sarucán is an international consultant. From 2007 to 2013, he was Mexico's ambassador to the United States. He wrote, "Can Mexico avoid a confrontation with the United States?" for Foreign Affairs magazine. Thanks for being with us today.
A great pleasure, John. Thank you for having me on the show.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Once again, I'm John McKay, in today for Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a mighty day.